I own rental properties. And so tell us what these mistakes that could cost someone like that.
Well, so in 2019, just pre-COVID, well, let me back up a step while we're at it. Let's go back to 2018. We had an election in California, and one of the propositions was Proposition 10, which was, do we want to initiate rent control in California? Not only did that measure fail, it failed by a tremendous amount. 67% of the California population said, no, we don't want rent control. So, of course, our legislator turned around immediately and wrote a rent control bill, which essentially mirrored what the voters had said, no, we don't want. And then that became reality in 2020. That passed and became reality. You got to understand, down at the ledge, under the dome down there, we've got a supermajority, right? They do what they want. They don't have to listen to anyone, and that's California. So that was passed in 2020. And when we think of rent control, we say, oh, you can't raise the rent. You can't raise. Well, let me tell you, the bill is 9 pages long. 9 pages of about 10-point print. So there's a lot of reading in there. In that entire bill, one paragraph is dedicated to how much you can increase the rent. And it's no big deal. It's just CPI plus 5%. Whoop-de-doo. That's one paragraph. So what the heck are the rest of these 9 pages, right? They're regulations that tell you what you can and cannot do in many, many situations. When a tenant doesn't pay rent, instead of giving them the 3-day notice and doing what we used to do, there's a whole new process. And that's just one example. There's many, many examples of what happened in that bill that gave tenants a tremendous number of rights that most landlords and unfortunately a lot of property management companies still 6 years later are not fully aware of. For example, if a tenant has lived in a rent-controlled property for 12 months and you want to sell that property, and this goes to realtors. Realtors, if you're out there listening, if you are wanting to list a property that has a tenant in it, no longer do we just hand them a 60-day notice and say, hey, I need you to vacate, right? For that, and this legislation now over the past 6 years has gained teeth. So meaning that if you do it, it's not just whoops, don't do that. It's a fine, and a big fine. And that owner, you can deliver the wrong notice and the owner is now subject to an immediate $25,000 fine, plus civil damages, plus real damages if the tenant suffered. So let's say you gave them a notice. Am I going too fast?
No,
this is awesome.
This is awesome.
Good stuff.
I'm getting all deep and technical, but
we love it.
Let's say you give us, okay, here's a 60-day notice vacate, and then you didn't understand that this tenant is living in a rent-controlled property, and you can't give that notice. You can't give a notice to vacate because you want to sell. What if the tenant moves, and they move to a place with a higher rent? And they figure out a year later, hey, wait a minute, I didn't have, because they had dinner with their buddy who's a lawyer, and they can come back and sue for, well, almost anything, right? I mean, first of all, you shouldn't have given them that notice. Now they've incurred cost to move. They've incurred higher rent. So you can imagine what the landlord could be liable for. And we've seen these cases where landlords have come in and, I didn't know, I gave them the old notice, or that my property manager gave them the old notice. So you have to be aware that you simply cannot give a notice to vacate because you want to sell the property. You have to work with the tenant in other ways. And we can get into some of that. But if you're a realtor, look, the bottom line is don't try to memorize if I do tell you how to do it. You really need to, call a property manager and find out, is this tenant under rent control? They're going to ask you about, if they know what they're doing, they're going to ask you about 5 or 6 questions, and they'll say, yeah, that tenant's under rent control. Don't do that. Or nope, they're not under rent control. Go ahead and use the old form or something like that. So you need to be, realtors, you need to be aware of what, you got to know what you don't know. You got to understand what you don't know, and you got to go seek advice. Don't mess with a tenant unless you really have a clear understanding of what you're doing.